Today's story is, she asked only for a corner to sleep. A year later, the Mafia Boss's 6 sons built her a cozy room. Why would a woman surrounded by luxury ask for nothing more than a corner to sleep in? And what could make 6 boys remember that simple request for an entire year? Hello, everyone, and welcome. If stories about kindness, dignity, and the unexpected ways people can change one another mean something to you, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Thank you for spending your time with us and for continuing to support these stories. And tell us in the comments, if someone asked you for nothing more than a corner to sleep in, what would you remember about that request a year later? Now, let's begin today's story. Sir, I don't need a bedroom. Grace Bennett's words stopped Vincent Callahan halfway through removing his black leather gloves. Outside, November rain struck the tall windows of the Callahan estate, turning the sprawling grounds beyond them into a blur of silver and darkness. Inside, everything gleamed: marble floors, mahogany walls, crystal lights glowing above a foyer large enough to swallow Grace's entire old apartment. Vincent slowly turned. Grace stood near the entrance with one battered suitcase held between both hands. She was 34, a beautiful plus-size black woman with soft brown eyes and a gentle face that seemed strangely untouched by the exhaustion beneath them. Her dark curls had been gathered into a simple bun. Rain still glistened across the shoulders of her inexpensive coat. Vincent had seen frightened people before. They usually talked too much. Grace barely spoke at all. What did you say? Grace swallowed. The housekeeper said there wasn't a staff bedroom ready tonight. Her fingers tightened around the suitcase handle. I'm saying it's all right. I only need a corner somewhere. Somewhere dry. Vincent stared at her. Men had begged him for houses. Women had asked him for jewelry, cars, favors, introductions. Nobody had ever stood beneath a chandelier worth more than most families earned in 10 years and asked Vincent Callahan for a corner of the floor. You were hired as a live-in housekeeper, he said. You need somewhere to sleep. A blanket is enough. Something about the answer irritated him. Not because she sounded ungrateful, because she sounded practiced, as though asking for less had become a survival skill. Before Vincent could respond, Margaret Hale appeared from the eastern corridor, posture rigid beneath her gray uniform. There's a storage room beside the old laundry, she said. Temporarily. Grace immediately nodded. That's perfect. Vincent's eyes narrowed. He knew that room. Everyone did. It was barely large enough for a narrow mattress and an old wooden dresser. That is not perfect. Grace finally looked directly at him. Her eyes were steady. It has a door, doesn't it? The question landed harder than it should have. Vincent said nothing. Grace lowered her gaze again and followed Margaret down the corridor, her suitcase rolling softly behind her. Click, click, click. Then the mansion swallowed the sound. Vincent remained beneath the chandelier. For reasons he could not explain, the most feared man in that house suddenly found himself thinking about a woman grateful for a door. Hours later, the estate fell silent. Grace lay beneath a thin blanket in the tiny room beside the laundry, listening to rain murmur inside the gutters. She should have been asleep. Tomorrow began at 5. Then she heard it. A floorboard creaked outside. Grace opened her eyes. Another creak. Then another. She slowly sat up. There were no voices. Only breathing. Grace crossed the room and opened the door. The hallway appeared empty at first. Then she looked down. A small boy stood barefoot in the darkness. Behind him were 5 more. 6 sons. 6 silent faces. And not one of them smiled. The 6 boys stood in the hallway as though they had been caught committing a crime. Grace kept one hand on the doorknob. The smallest boy couldn't have been older than 7. His blonde hair stuck up on one side, and he clutched a faded blue blanket against his chest. Behind him stood 5 older versions of the same guarded face. Pale skin, sharp Callahan features, eyes trained far too young to reveal nothing. Grace looked from one to another. Well, she whispered, this is either a very serious meeting or none of you knows where your beds are. No one laughed. The oldest boy stepped forward. Ben had a nightmare. His name was Ethan, 17, Vincent's firstborn. Grace would later learn that Ethan had appointed himself the second adult in the house the night his mother died. Tonight, he simply looked tired. I didn't, Ben muttered. You screamed. I did not. You woke Luke. Did not. Guys, 13-year-old Caleb snapped. Stop. And just like that, Grace understood something. These children weren't standing outside her door because they wanted the new housekeeper. They were standing there because none of them knew what else to do. Grace crouched until she was level with Ben. She didn't touch him. Bad dreams can be rude, she said softly. They come into your head without knocking. Ben studied her. Do you get them? Grace's smile weakened. Sometimes. That answer seemed sufficient. He moved one step closer. Grace opened her door wider. Her room contained a narrow mattress, one lamp, an old dresser, and her suitcase. There was nowhere for 6 boys to sit, so they sat on the floor. All of them. Grace almost laughed at the absurdity. The Callahan estate had 23 bedrooms, 3 sitting rooms, a private theater, and furniture imported from Italy. Yet 6 wealthy children had crowded into a laundry room corner because one frightened little boy didn't want to be alone. Grace found an extra blanket and spread it across the floor. What happens now? 11-year-old Owen asked. Nothing. He frowned. Aren't you going to make Ben talk about the nightmare? No, Dad always asks what happened. Grace glanced at Ben. The child's fingers had gone white around his blanket. Sometimes, she said, people need to know you're staying before they're ready to tell you why they're hurting. The room became quiet. Ethan looked away first. Grace noticed. Over the next several days, she began noticing many things. Ethan never asked for help. Noah, 15, ate alone. Caleb became angry whenever anyone mentioned their mother. Owen made jokes whenever a room became too emotional. Luke followed his brothers everywhere, but spoke less than all of them. And Ben checked every doorway twice before sleeping. 6 boys. 6 different kinds of grief. Their mother, Claire Callahan, had been dead for almost 2 years. Vincent had responded the only way he understood. He fortified. More guards. More rules. More tutors. More security cameras. More control. He had protected his sons from every danger outside the gates. He simply hadn't known what to do with the pain already inside them. Grace did not try to fix it. That was what made her different. She learned who hated crusts on sandwiches, who needed silence after school, who pretended not to like cinnamon, who left lights on because darkness felt too empty. Small things. Invisible things. Things nobody had ordered her to notice. Then, one evening, Vincent returned home earlier than expected. He loosened his tie as he crossed the second-floor corridor. Something stopped him. Laughter. Not polite laughter. Not television. His sons. Vincent followed the sound to the dining room. All 6 chairs were occupied. Grace was setting down a crooked homemade pie while Owen argued that Caleb had stolen the largest slice before anyone had even started eating. Ben laughed so hard milk nearly came through his nose. Vincent froze in the doorway. For nearly 2 years, he had tried everything to put his family back together. Therapists. Vacations. Money. Rules. Nothing had worked. Grace looked up and saw him. Her smile disappeared. Mr. Callahan. 6 heads turned. The laughter died. Vincent felt the old distance return instantly. And for the first time, he understood something that frightened him more than disobedience ever could. His sons knew how to be children around Grace. Around their father, they still remembered how to be soldiers. Vincent said nothing about the dinner. That frightened Grace more than anger would have. The next morning, she found him at the head of the breakfast table, dressed in a charcoal suit, reading messages on his phone while 6 empty chairs surrounded him. By 7:15, he was gone. Grace noticed his coffee had gone cold beside his phone. The next morning, without thinking, she poured it a little later so it would still be hot. When he came downstairs, Vincent noticed. He said nothing, but before leaving he looked back at her once, as though unused to someone remembering something so small. By 7:20, Ben appeared in the doorway. Do we have pie left? Grace smiled, and life inside the Callahan estate continued. She never announced that she was helping the boys. She never tried to replace the mother whose photographs still stood on the upstairs piano. Instead, Grace noticed things. When Ethan came home after midnight with blood on his knuckles, she didn't interrogate him. She placed an ice pack beside his bedroom door. The following morning, it was gone. When Noah received a rejection letter from a music program he had secretly applied to, Grace found him tearing sheet music into pieces. She didn't tell him everything happened for a reason. She simply sat on the floor and helped tape the pages back together. Caleb was different. Anger lived inside him like a match waiting for friction. One afternoon, he shattered a glass after losing an argument with Ethan. Everyone froze. Grace quietly handed him a broom. You're not mad. I didn't say that. Caleb stared at her. Then why aren't you yelling? Because broken glass is already loud enough. His expression changed. He swept every piece. Owen hid behind humor. Luke hid behind silence. Ben hid behind his blanket. Grace learned all 3 languages. Weeks became months. Winter pressed snow against the mansion windows, and something almost invisible began happening inside. Doors stayed open. Shoes accumulated near the kitchen. Homework appeared on the dining table. Someone was always looking for Grace. Miss Grace, have you seen my charger? Grace, tell Caleb he's cheating. Miss Grace, can you taste this? Grace, Grace, Grace. She answered when she could, but she never made herself indispensable. That mattered. She wanted the boys to need one another more than they needed her. One bitter February night, Vincent returned shortly after 11. His coat smelled faintly of snow and expensive tobacco. 2 armed men remained downstairs while he climbed toward his study. Then he noticed something outside Grace's room. Shoes. 6 pairs. Vincent stopped. The door was slightly open. Warm yellow light spilled across the hallway. He approached without making a sound. Inside, Grace sat against the old dresser with a book resting across her lap. The room was absurdly crowded. Ben lay beneath a blanket near her feet. Luke leaned against Owen. Caleb pretended not to be interested while listening from the mattress. Noah sat cross-legged beside the wall. Ethan occupied the doorway. Grace was reading. Not dramatically. Not performing. Just reading in that low, steady voice that somehow made the tiny room feel warmer than the rest of the enormous house. Vincent remained unseen. Then Grace reached the end of the chapter. That's it for tonight. 6 protests erupted. One more. You said that last time. Grace. Tomorrow. Ben groaned. Grace closed the book. Ethan stood first. Before leaving, he bent down and quietly pulled the blanket higher over Ben's shoulders. Vincent's eyes narrowed. He had not seen Ethan do something that gentle in years. One by one, the boys filed into the hallway. Vincent stepped into the shadows before they could notice him. When the last footsteps disappeared, he looked through the open doorway again. Grace was alone now. She gathered abandoned cups, folded the blanket, then lowered herself onto the same narrow mattress she had slept on since arriving. Her back clearly hurt. She rubbed it once, then stopped. No complaint. No request. Vincent looked around the tiny room. Grace caught him in the doorway, and, for a quiet second, neither spoke. His expression held none of the authority he wore downstairs. Only a father's gratitude and a loneliness she suddenly recognized. Grace gave him a small, tired smile. Vincent returned it, almost uncertainly. It was the first moment between them that belonged to neither his power nor her employment. Then Vincent looked around the tiny room. For months, Grace had been noticing everything his sons needed. Their fears, their silences, their small preferences, their grief. And suddenly Vincent realized something that left him standing motionless in the dark. Everyone in this house had begun looking for Grace. But nobody had ever asked what Grace needed. Margaret Hale had spent 21 years making sure everyone in the Callahan estate understood where they belonged. After Claire Callahan died, Margaret had clung even harder to rules and hierarchy, convinced that order was the only thing keeping grief from swallowing the household. Grace Bennett was beginning to make those lines disappear, and Margaret mistook that change for danger. It happened on a Saturday evening in March. Vincent was hosting 12 guests in the formal dining room. Men in tailored suits, women glittering beneath chandeliers, people whose smiles were polished enough to conceal what they actually thought. Grace moved quietly between them with a silver coffee service. She preferred evenings like this. Keep moving. Keep invisible. Then Ben entered. He was supposed to be upstairs. The 7-year-old stopped when he saw the strangers, immediately overwhelmed by the noise. Grace. His voice was tiny. Grace set down the coffee pot. Before she could move, Margaret intercepted him. Master Benjamin, you should return upstairs. Ben ignored her. His eyes remained on Grace. Can you come with me? A woman at the table smiled. How sweet. He's attached to the maid. Another guest chuckled. Grace felt the words, but showed nothing. She crossed toward Ben. Margaret caught her arm. Not now. Grace looked down at the hand gripping her sleeve. Mrs. Hale, you are working. Benjamin has a father. The room quieted slightly. Vincent sat at the far end of the table, his expression unreadable. Margaret lowered her voice, but not enough. You've become far too comfortable in this house. Beneath Margaret's sharpness was something Grace had begun to recognize. Fear of a household changing beyond the rules Margaret had trusted for decades. It did not excuse the cruelty. Grace went still. Excuse me. You eat with the boys. They gather in your room. They call for you constantly. Margaret glanced toward the guests. You are still the maid, Grace. Remember your place. Silence. Grace felt heat climb into her face. Not because she was ashamed of her work. She had cleaned toilets, washed sheets, scrubbed floors, and never considered honest labor beneath her. What hurt was the intention. Margaret wanted her to feel small. Grace slowly removed Margaret's hand from her sleeve. My place right now, she said quietly, is wherever that frightened child needs a calm adult. Margaret's jaw tightened. You are not their mother. That one landed. Grace's eyes flickered toward the family portrait above the fireplace. Claire Callahan smiled from another lifetime. Grace took one breath. No, she said. I'm not. She turned toward Ben. Then a chair scraped against marble. Ethan stood. Margaret blinked. Another chair moved. Noah rose. Then Caleb. Owen. Luke. 5 boys crossed the room without being told. Ben immediately joined them. 6 brothers stood beside Grace. Nobody spoke. They didn't need to. Margaret's face drained of color. Grace stared at them, stunned. Boys, she whispered. Ethan looked directly at Margaret. She knows her place. His voice was controlled. She's standing with us. The dining room went completely still. Vincent had not moved. That was what made him frightening. He slowly placed his glass on the table. Margaret, one word. Nothing more. She turned toward him. Mr. Callahan, I was only maintaining proper boundaries. Vincent looked at his sons. 6 boys who once scattered to separate rooms after dinner were now standing shoulder to shoulder. Then he looked at Grace. Her eyes were wet. Her back remained straight. No employee in my house, Vincent said, will be humiliated for showing kindness to my children. Margaret swallowed. Yes, sir. Apologize. Her lips parted. For 21 years, Margaret had commanded nearly every servant beneath this roof. Now 12 wealthy guests watched her turn toward the woman she had tried to diminish. I apologize, Grace. Grace nodded. Thank you. No triumph. No smile. No revenge. And somehow that made Margaret's humiliation deeper. Grace took Ben's hand and led him toward the hallway. The other boys followed. Vincent watched them disappear. Something inside him should have felt satisfied. Instead, he felt exposed. His sons had stood up for Grace without hesitation. They had done what family did. And Vincent could not escape the question forming quietly beneath his ribs. When had Grace taught his sons to protect one another? And why had their father never managed to teach them first? The first punch landed before Vincent reached the kitchen. A chair crashed against the floor. Then came Caleb's voice. I hate you. Vincent stopped in the hallway. Inside, all 6 boys were gathered around the long breakfast table, but there was nothing familiar about the scene. Ethan stood near the window, jaw clenched. Caleb faced him with both fists tight. Noah stared at the floor. Owen had stopped joking. Luke looked frightened. Ben was crying. Grace stood between them. What happened? Vincent's voice cut through the room. Everyone froze. Caleb turned. Ask him. Vincent looked at Ethan. Explain. Nothing happened. Caleb laughed bitterly. Of course. Nothing ever happens to Ethan. Enough, Vincent said. That single word usually ended arguments. This time, Caleb exploded. He's leaving. Silence. Vincent's eyes shifted toward Ethan. The 17-year-old looked away. Grace already knew. She had found the acceptance letter that morning after Ethan left it unopened beside his breakfast plate. A boarding academy in Massachusetts. Ethan had applied months earlier without telling his brothers. I leave in August, he said. Ben's crying grew louder. Luke whispered, You promised. Ethan flinched. I promised what? That you wouldn't leave us. I'm not Mom. The words struck the room like breaking glass. Nobody moved. Ethan immediately regretted them. Caleb lunged. Vincent caught him before he reached his brother. Stop. Let me go. Enough. Vincent's command thundered through the kitchen. Ben covered his ears. Noah walked away. Owen stared at the table. And Grace watched the family fracture along the same invisible line that had been running through it for 2 years. Vincent tightened his grip on Caleb. You will apologize. No, you will. Make me. Vincent's face hardened. Grace stepped forward. Mr. Callahan. Not now. Let him go. Every head turned. Vincent stared at her. What? Please. Something in her voice made him release Caleb. Grace pulled out a chair. Everybody sit. Nobody did. Grace waited. I said sit. Ethan almost smiled despite himself. One by one, they obeyed. Even Vincent remained silent. Grace looked at Ethan first. You want to leave? Ethan's throat moved. I want to know who I am somewhere nobody needs me to be dad. Vincent's expression changed. Grace turned to Caleb. You're angry because he's leaving? No, then why? Caleb's eyes filled. Because everybody leaves. There it was. Not anger. Fear. Grace looked at Noah. You've barely spoken. Noah rubbed his palms together. If Ethan goes, Dad will expect me to become him. Vincent inhaled sharply. Owen's smile was nowhere to be found. I make jokes because when everybody starts talking about Mom, I feel like I can't breathe. Luke whispered. I leave my door open because I'm scared something will happen while I'm asleep. Then Ben looked at Vincent. Dad, why don't you eat with us? That question did what shouting could not. Vincent Callahan had faced guns without blinking. Now he had no answer for a 7-year-old. Grace did not rescue him. She did not soften the silence. She let it remain. Finally, Vincent pulled out a chair. Then Saturday, I thought keeping this house safe was my job, he said quietly. Ethan looked at him. It is. Vincent nodded. But apparently I confused keeping you alive with being here. No one spoke. His hands folded on the table. I was wrong. 6 boys stared at their father as if he had just spoken a language they had never heard. Grace stepped backward. This moment did not belong to her. Vincent noticed. For months, he had believed Grace's gift was comforting his sons. He understood now that it was something harder. She made them tell the truth without turning truth into a weapon. She had not repaired 6 broken boys. She had taught them to see one another. And as Vincent looked around that table, he realized the person who needed that lesson most had been sitting at its head all along. Grace waited 3 days before asking Vincent for anything. In 6 months, she had never requested a raise, never complained about the tiny room, never asked for lighter hours, new clothes, or even a better mattress. So when she appeared at the door of Vincent's study on Thursday evening and said, Mr. Callahan, I need something from you, he immediately closed the file in front of him. How much? Grace blinked. I'm sorry. Whatever you need. He reached for his checkbook. Grace looked at it. Then at him. I don't want your money. Vincent's hand stopped. That answer unsettled him more than any number could have. What do you want? Tuesday. His brow furrowed. Tuesday. Dinner. 6:30. Vincent leaned back. I have a meeting. I know. With people who don't reschedule. Grace remained still. Then make them. The room changed. Vincent's eyes hardened. Men twice Grace's size had lowered their voices under that stare. Grace did not. You're forgetting who you're speaking to. No, sir. Her voice remained gentle. That's exactly why I'm speaking. Vincent rose. Power seemed to rise with him. You work in my house, Grace. You do not manage my calendar. No, she swallowed. But your sons shouldn't have to make appointments to have a father. Silence. Vincent's jaw tightened. You think because they trust you, you understand this family? I think Ethan is leaving in a few months. His expression shifted. I think Noah is terrified you'll expect him to replace Ethan. Caleb thinks loving people means waiting for them to leave. Owen turns pain into jokes. Luke sleeps with his door open. And Ben still watches the driveway every evening. Vincent said nothing. Grace's eyes softened. They don't need another security guard. That is enough. No, sir. The words came quietly. But they came. They need you. Vincent walked around the desk. You have no idea what I do to keep this family alive. You're right. Grace's voice trembled now, but she did not retreat. I don't know your business. I don't want to. She looked toward the family photograph on his bookshelf. But I know what it looks like when children stop expecting someone to show up. That hit somewhere Vincent kept armored. His voice dropped. Be careful. Grace nodded. I am. Then she did something nobody in Vincent Callahan's world ever did. She gave him a choice without begging. Tuesday. 6:30. She turned toward the door. Grace. She stopped. If I say no. Grace looked back. Then I'll still serve dinner. No accusation. No threat. That's my job. She left. Vincent remained alone. For several minutes, anger burned through him. Who was she to speak to him that way? He had built an empire while raising 6 sons after burying his wife. He had protected them from enemies they didn't even know existed. Everything in that mansion, the walls, the guards, the schools, their futures, had been paid for by sacrifices they would never understand. And yet one sentence refused to leave him. Children stop expecting someone to show up. Tuesday arrived. At 6:28, 6 boys sat around the dining table. At 6:29, Ben glanced toward the doorway. At 6:30, he lowered his eyes. Then footsteps sounded across the marble. Vincent entered. No suit jacket. No bodyguards. No phone. He pulled out the chair at the head of the table. Ben stared. "You're eating?" Vincent unfolded his napkin. "If there's enough." Owen nearly choked. "There's always enough." Grace stood near the kitchen doorway. Vincent looked at her once. Nothing passed between them except a small nod. Then he turned back to his sons. For the first time in years, he asked Ethan about school and stayed long enough to hear the answer. Later, when Grace collected the empty plates, Vincent remained behind. "You always know what they need," he said. Grace shook her head. "I listen." He studied her. "And what do you need?" The question caught her completely off guard. No one in the mansion had asked it before. "I'm still figuring that out," she admitted. Vincent nodded instead of answering for her. Grace carried the plates away, strangely aware that he was still watching her. For once, the attention did not feel like power. It felt like interest. She had finally asked Vincent Callahan for something. And once again, it had not been for herself. Grace Bennett first thought about leaving on a Sunday morning. There was no argument. No humiliation. No slammed door. That was what made the thought hurt. She stood in the kitchen doorway watching Vincent burn pancakes, while 6 boys shouted contradictory instructions. "Flip it." "Dad, not yet. It's smoking." "That one's dead." Ben laughed so hard he nearly fell from his chair. Vincent Callahan, the man whose name could silence rooms across Chicago, stood helplessly over a frying pan while Owen opened a window to release the smoke. Grace smiled. Then something inside her ached. They were becoming a family again, without needing her to hold every broken piece together. Over the following weeks, she noticed it everywhere. Ethan drove Luke to school without being asked. Noah played piano while Caleb did homework nearby. Owen stopped turning every difficult conversation into a joke. Ben began sleeping through the night. And Vincent? Vincent came home. Not always, but enough. Tuesday dinners became sacred. Phones disappeared from the table. Bodyguards waited outside. Sometimes nobody said anything important. That was the beautiful part. A family did not heal only through dramatic moments. Sometimes healing looked like passing potatoes. Grace understood that. She also understood something else. Maybe her work here was finished. That evening, she opened her battered suitcase. It was the same suitcase she had carried into the mansion months earlier. She folded 2 dresses inside, then stopped, going somewhere. Grace spun around. Ethan stood in the doorway. No, his eyes dropped to the suitcase. "That looks like somewhere." Grace sighed. "I've been thinking." Those 4 words frightened him. About what? Finding another position eventually. Ethan's face closed. "You're leaving." "I didn't say that." "You packed." "I folded 2 dresses." "That's how leaving starts." Grace stared at him. For a 17-year-old who had spent years pretending he needed nobody, Ethan suddenly looked very young. "Your family is stronger now." So maybe that's a good thing." "For who?" Grace had no answer ready. Ethan looked around her room. For the first time, he truly looked. The narrow mattress. The old dresser. 1 lamp. A coat hanging from a nail because there was no closet. 6 boys had spent countless evenings in this room. None had ever noticed how little of it belonged to Grace. His eyes moved to the suitcase. "You've been sleeping here the whole time?" Grace almost laughed. "Ethan, you knew that?" "No," he shook his head slowly. "I knew this was your room." There was a difference. He understood it now. That night, Ethan called an emergency meeting. No adults. The 6 brothers crowded into Noah's bedroom. "She might leave," Ethan said. Ben immediately began crying. "We tell Dad." "No," Ethan said. Caleb frowned. "Why not?" "Because Dad fixes everything with money." Owen nodded solemnly. "He'll buy her Rhode Island." Despite himself, Noah laughed. Then Luke asked the question that changed the room. "What does Grace want?" Silence. 6 boys looked at one another. They knew how she took her coffee. They knew her favorite pie. They knew she hummed when nervous and hated seeing wet towels on the floor. But what did she want? Ben wiped his eyes. "She likes when everybody's okay." "That's not something for her," Noah said. Another silence. Then Ethan remembered the first night. Grace had asked for only a corner. Nothing more. His gaze sharpened. For months, Grace had noticed every small thing about them. Now, for the first time, 6 boys began noticing her. The mattress that hurt her back. The books stacked on the floor. The missing closet. The single lamp. The corner she had accepted without complaint. Ethan slowly looked at his brothers. We're not asking Dad to fix this. Caleb leaned forward. Then who will? Ethan's eyes moved from one face to the next. We will. The locked door appeared on Monday. Grace noticed it because nothing stayed locked inside the Callahan estate without a reason. It was an unused guest room at the end of the west corridor, a quiet space that had remained untouched for years. Now the brass handle refused to turn. Grace frowned. Then she heard something crash inside. Ow. Caleb. Grace knocked immediately. Everything all right? Silence. Then Owen answered. Absolutely. Another crash. Grace narrowed her eyes. What are you doing? Homework. With a hammer? A pause. Advanced homework. Grace almost opened her mouth again. Then 6 pairs of footsteps scrambled away from the door. She smiled despite herself. Whatever they were doing, they clearly wanted it hidden. The mystery continued for weeks. Packages arrived under Ethan's name. Noah began carrying paint samples inside schoolbooks. Luke disappeared with measuring tape. Owen asked Grace, with suspicious casualness, whether she preferred yellow light or white light. Why? Science. Ben asked her favorite color. Green. What kind? Grace laughed. The peaceful kind. Ben nodded seriously and walked away. She should have understood. She didn't. Vincent did. He discovered the operation late one evening when he found Caleb and Ethan attempting to carry a wooden bookshelf upstairs. They froze. Vincent looked at the shelf, then at his sons. Explain. Ethan straightened. We're handling it. That wasn't an explanation. Caleb shifted nervously. It's for Grace. Vincent went still. Ethan finally told him everything. The room. The mattress. The possibility that Grace might leave. Their plan. Vincent listened without interrupting. When they finished, he pulled out his phone. I'll have contractors here tomorrow. No, Vincent slowly lowered the phone. Ethan met his eyes. We want to do it. You don't know how. We're learning. You could have the entire room professionally finished in 48 hours. That's not the point. Vincent stared at his eldest son. A year earlier, Ethan would never have challenged him over something like this. A year earlier, Vincent would never have understood why he was right. So the contractors never came. Instead, Vincent quietly arranged for an electrician to make the wiring safe and a carpenter to repair what the boys could not. Everything else belonged to them. They sanded, painted, measured badly, measured again. Caleb built one shelf crooked and refused to admit it until books slid off. Noah chose a small reading chair after remembering how Grace always read beside the laundry room lamp. Luke found curtains the color of warm cream. Owen discovered an old dresser in storage and spent 3 afternoons restoring it. Ben painted a tiny wooden sign. The letters were uneven. Grace. That was all it said. Vincent watched from the doorway more than once. One evening, Grace passed him there while the boys argued cheerfully over a crooked shelf. There. Shoulders nearly touched. Inside the room, Ben laughed. Vincent looked toward the sound, and Grace looked at him. Neither needed to explain what had changed in the house. His expression softened, and hers answered before she could stop it. Then she continued down the corridor, carrying the quiet warmth of that shared glance with her. Vincent never took over. That was difficult for him. Power had taught Vincent that love meant providing the best. Grace had taught his son something different. Sometimes love meant providing yourself. Your time. Your attention. Your sore hands. Your mistakes. One evening, Vincent found all 6 boys asleep inside the unfinished room. Paint rollers lay nearby. Ethan was against the wall. Ben slept curled beneath his brother's arm. Vincent looked around. Nothing matched perfectly. The paint had imperfections. One shelf leaned slightly. A small patch near the window needed another coat. It was the least professionally finished room in the entire mansion. And somehow, it felt more human than any other. Vincent quietly covered the boys with a drop cloth they had been using as a blanket. Then his eyes landed on the empty space where the bed would go. He remembered Grace standing beneath the chandelier on her first night. A blanket is enough. At the time, Vincent had heard modesty. Now he heard something else. A woman who had learned not to expect comfort. His sons were about to challenge that lesson. Behind him, Ben stirred. Dad. Vincent turned. Did she find out? No, Ben relaxed. Good. His eyes closed again. Vincent reached for the light. Dad. Yes. Ben's sleepy voice barely carried across the room. Do you think she'll stay if she knows she has a place here? Vincent's hand froze on the switch. For once, the Mafia boss had no answer. He only looked at the room 6 boys were building with their own hands. Then he whispered into the darkness, "I hope so." The room was finished exactly 1 year after Grace Bennett arrived at the Callahan estate. She did not know the date mattered. The boys did. That morning, the mansion felt suspiciously quiet. At breakfast, Owen barely spoke. Caleb kept exchanging looks with Noah. Ben smiled. Every time Grace turned around. Finally, Ethan appeared in the kitchen doorway. "Grace, we need you upstairs." Grace frowned. "Why?" "Just come." 6 boys escorted her toward the west corridor. Vincent waited near the end. Grace slowed when she saw him. "What happened?" "Nothing," Vincent said. For once, there was no steel in his voice. Ethan stopped before the locked door. Ben stepped forward. His small hand disappeared into his pocket. "1 year ago," he said carefully, "you came here." Grace's smile faded. "You remember that?" "We remember more than you think." Ben pulled out a key. Grace looked at Vincent. He gave nothing away. The lock clicked. Ethan opened the door. Warm golden light spilled into the hallway. Grace stopped breathing. The room was simple, beautiful. Soft green walls surrounded a real bed covered in a cream quilt. Warm curtains framed the window. A reading chair rested beside a small bookshelf filled with novels. There was a closet, a dresser, a thick rug. On the wall hung 6 small photographs, one chosen by each boy. Grace took 1 step inside, then another. Her hand rose to her mouth. She noticed the imperfections immediately. A shelf leaned slightly. Paint near the window was uneven. One drawer stuck when she touched it. Grace turned. "You did this." 6 faces watched her. Owen shrugged. "Professionals would have done it better." "No," Grace whispered. Her voice broke. "They wouldn't have." Ben hurried toward the nightstand and picked up the small wooden sign he had painted. "Grace, we thought you needed something that said it was yours." That was when she cried. Not politely, not quietly. Grace covered her face as months of exhaustion, gratitude, and feelings she had carefully contained finally escaped. Ben wrapped his arms around her waist. Luke followed, then Owen, Caleb, Noah. Ethan hesitated only a second before joining them. 6 boys disappeared against Grace's embrace. Vincent remained at the doorway. His eyes burned. Grace looked over their heads at him. "You knew?" Vincent nodded. "They wouldn't let me buy it." A laugh escaped through her tears. "Good. They said that would be cheating." "It would." Vincent almost smiled. Then, Ethan stepped back. "We heard you might leave." Grace looked at him. "And we know a room can't make somebody stay." His voice softened. "But we wanted you to know you have one." Grace's eyes filled again. Not a debt, not an obligation. A place. She looked around at everything these boys had remembered. The green she called peaceful. The warm light. The books. Even a small table beside the window where someone had placed her favorite tea. For most of her life, Grace had survived by asking for less. Take up less room. Need less. Expect less. It had protected her from disappointment. But standing there, she understood what these children had spent a year learning. Kindness was not supposed to make a person disappear. Love noticed. Love remembered. Love made room. "I'm not leaving," she whispered. Ben immediately cheered. The others laughed. Vincent looked away for a moment, composing himself. Then Grace approached him. "You gave them this?" Vincent shook his head. "You did." Grace frowned. "I never taught them how to build a room." "No," Vincent looked at his sons. "You taught them to notice when someone else needed one." Silence settled over the hallway. Not the cold silence that had once filled the Callahan mansion. This one was warm, full, alive. Months later, Ethan left for Massachusetts. Noah cried and didn't hide it. Caleb hugged him first. Owen made 3 terrible jokes at the airport. Luke kept Ethan's bedroom exactly as he left it. Ben counted the days until Christmas. And Vincent? Vincent kept coming to dinner. Grace stayed, not because she owed the Callahans anything. She stayed because the place that had once offered her employment had slowly become something neither money nor power could purchase. A home. Years afterward, visitors would admire the marble staircase, the paintings, the enormous chandeliers. But the Callahan boys always remembered a much smaller room. A room with imperfect paint, a crooked shelf, and a little wooden sign bearing one woman's name. Because the woman who once asked for almost nothing had taught 6 privileged boys something their father's empire never could. A person's worth is not measured by how much space they demand. It is revealed by how much warmth they leave behind. And in a house once filled with closed doors, Grace Bennett had opened every one that mattered.